I'm the Chief Executive of an organisation, Salford, Stockport and Trafford Local Medical Committee. With you all working in general practice, you will have a local medical committee in your area. We cover 93 practices in our sort of day job, and we have a team. Just to quickly bring this slide up, the majority of which will be on this call somewhere. So stick your cameras on, give us a wave. This is a team effort. Everything we do as an LMC is a team effort, and we're lucky to have so many experts in general practice on our little team, from GPs to practice manager partners to business managers to practice manager forum chairs, people with many years of experience in commissioning. That includes myself and Joe, but also I started out as a nurse and have been in the LMC supporting practices day in, day out for the last 10 years. And it's incredibly rewarding. So the team are on hand as well if anyone wants to chip in. And I just was going to go through the usual housekeeping. Where we might differ is, we know most webinars usually say to people, can you switch cameras off? But feel free to leave yours on. It's quite difficult talking to an empty screen sometimes, but appreciate you're probably having some lunch as well as doing this. We will share all the slides, and the additional resources that we talk to today will be shared. Okay, we will be recording, so others are not able to attend can view it at their leisure, or you can go back over it. And we will endeavour to pause to take questions at various points of the session. We'll leave the chat on, although team, I can't see it. So we will try and get to that. If we don't, we will follow up at the end. If it becomes unwieldy, then we'll just pause that for a little while as well. This is a safe space, no judgments. We all have first-hand experience of the pressures that everybody's facing. And this really is about, if we had a lounge big enough, we'd be doing it in that, because it makes it much more relaxed. So, but that's the feeling I'm trying to create. Lastly, and the hardest one for you all, is try and avoid doing something else for the next hour and a half. I know that will be a very alien concept, but you've decided it's important enough for you to prioritise this over the other million things you could be doing. Allow yourself to be present. Take a big deep breath in before we get into some of the detail, and try and take out as much as you can in the next hour and a half. Close down Outlook, emails, put your phone on silent, and if you've got a do not disturb side, stick that on as well. Okay, so recap. Why have we taken up the ask of providing these webinars for you? It's because our ultimate aim in everything we do, but also through this series, is for general practice in GM to thrive, not just survive, but really thrive. We want you to have a solid foundations in which allow you and your team to do your job effectively and in a way that you want to do your job, to help create a culture of openness, trust and continuous development, and be a place where you want to get up and go every day, rather than feel the cloud of doom loom as the Sunday night fades and Monday morning appears. And of course, to ensure regulatory compliance is achieved and embedded into the work practices of all of your team as standard, rather than just a few, probably those on the call know exactly how that feels like. So today, previously, we've looked at an introduction or a recap for those that know it on CQC and practice culture. We talked about the CQC single assessment framework and the inspection process. Today, let me go back. Today we're on module 2. So we touched on at the last one a little bit about culture, just introducing it. This is going to be full on spotlight on what culture is. And we're going to explore how it influences compliance and embeds effective practice working. And some of this will absolutely involve what inspectors are looking for behind the paperwork. So hopefully everyone's in the right place where they think they're supposed to be. So, okay, so we'll make a start. So at the end of the first session, we ended with this slide. Culture is lived, not written. It's observable and influential. Inspectors see through daily behaviours, but a positive culture is palpable. So this is where we're going to start today's session. We're going to break it down, what it means in reality, and what practices can do in order to create a palpable positive culture. And this isn't just for the CQC inspector's benefit, but for every day, for your benefit, for the sustainability of the practice, the health and well-being of your staff, and of course, the care that you provide your patients. So what is it and why does it matter? Some of these we put up in the last one very, very quickly. It's that thing, sometimes difficult to put into words. It's just the things, the way you do things around here. Shared behaviours, norms and unwritten rules shaping how the practice operates. It's actually defined by what the leaders within your organisation model, what your teams tolerate and what the systems you have in place reinforce. We know, and you will know, directly impacts safety, morale of staff, experience of staff and patients and their well-being, relationships, levels of trust, your motivation, quality of care that you provide, the quality of life that you all experience, achievement and outcomes, and it's across the board for staff and practices alike. And as we said last time, CQC recognised the right type of culture is the difference between good and outstanding. And we're going to have a look at why that is. So we'll start with the negatives, the unhealthy culture. Again, you might experience some of these yourself. You might have been inherited a culture, you might be new in post, you might have been there a very long time. Number of reasons, again, no judgments, but we're just outlining so everybody understands what an unhealthy culture might feel and look like. So staff may well feel not secure when raising concerns or questioning decisions. There's quite possibly a culture of blame takes precedence over learning. Communication is likely to be irregular or compartmentalized. So there might be strong communication, but it's within teams rather than across the whole practice. Policies, you've probably got 101 policies in your shared system, but they're not necessarily applied, or if they are, it might be unevenly. We all know this feeling, operating in a constant firefighting mode, and it becomes standard practice. And decisions are made typically without explanation, and rationale is then not understood by others, which hinders how they respond to an ask and whether or not they own it. So those are typically the things that we might see. The behavioural red flags that we might see. Anybody want to shout any out? And what behaviours that might actually show up in day to day?
Not turning up for work.
Not turning up for work, absolutely.
Passing the buck.
Yeah. Okay. Two major ones. So they can comprise of this and many other things, but concerns being dismissed, undermining between different staff groups, whether that's clinical to non-clinical or vice versa, difficult behaviours, so passing the buck, as you've said, Andrea, or passive aggressiveness, people have snidey comments, not wanting to say something in case there's a backlash, staff avoiding certain colleagues or rooms, not showing up at all, as somebody said, mistakes hidden due to fear of repercussions, and a lot of that's just how they are, or this is just how we do things, being sort of the accepted norm. The structural red flags that will be experienced will be due to some of the unrest, might just be due to no clear accountability, whether that's for tasks or decision making, no wider understanding of the why. Why do we ask you to do something? They just know, staff just know it's the what and how, rather than where it fits into the bigger picture. Policies exist but inconsistently followed, chronic understaffing, sickness or unmanageable workload expectations, high turnover, not just of admin teams, but it could be further reaching, lack of protected time for training, supervision and time together as a team. So everyone remains very silos, job in hand, without the structure and the opportunity to learn in a more shared environment. And things like poor induction of new staff, because that just breeds confusion and likely results in error. So the impact that this can create for practices, impact on the practice day to day, and I've written it wordy, so because you've got it to take away, but patient dissatisfaction, so you spend more time dealing with complaints. There could well be avoidable patient harm, so your rising significant events are on the rise. You're spending more time dealing with internal disputes and issues, difficulty recruiting and retaining staff. There's generally a poor use of resources, so things take longer, things cost more, but you're not necessarily achieving the outcome that you're looking for. Poor performance and achievement impacts quality, finances, and sustainability of the practice. Reputation, you might see that there's been an increase in patients leaving because they're dissatisfied. But you also might find the members of staff who you might identify as, your key support, you might find that they start to leave as well. External relationships strained. So we deal with a number of PCN disputes. There's probably been more PCN disputes that have come into our workflow in the last couple of years than internal practice disputes. But also there can be external tension with commissioners, with trusts and other providers. And rising external scrutiny, the CQC, coroners, your GPs might be in coroner's court more. Commissioners might be, I just want to come and see what's happening and bring you data, an unexpected sort of visit or email. And of course, you know, we know MPs aren't shy in coming forward when somebody's gone to them and you get that email in your inbox that you then have to deal with on top of everything else. So the impacts on individuals in working in a way that is very reactive is, of course, burnout and exhaustion, but also compassion fatigue, as they call it, where, you know, your filter's down a little bit lower than it might be, and your tolerance affected. People become apathetic. The willingness, the goodwill that they may show perhaps starts to fade, and people are feeling a little bit unmotivated. That's when you're likely to see your sickness absence increase. And what that then results in, as we know, the increased workload burden placed on others. Loss of confidence in staff and their identity, feeling undervalued or invisible, and a breakdown of trust and relationships. All sounds terrible, doesn't it? But we know it's not like this all of the time, for sure. But we're just going to the worst possible case scenarios at the moment. This being the most catastrophic set of consequences if you know, if the culture within the practice is not on stable footings. So avoidable harm can and is caused to patients, and that could result in deteriorating health or death. What can rise from that, of course, is complaints, is litigation, people being sued, people going to coroner's court. Worst case, and we have seen it over the years, CQC come in, they do assessments, they put people in special measures. Luckily, the majority of practices in that situation turn it around, but not always. And in those particular cases, contracts are terminated. However, all the contracts that the contract holder holds, whether that's for premises, phones, whatever the big expenditure is, they aren't always dealt with and don't have break clauses. So partners may have the contract removed, but they still have the ongoing liabilities financially. After you've had your contract removed or terminated, a partner can't ever hold a future contract in general practice following that. Of course, there's collateral damage for everybody who works in the practice, loss of job, or it might be a 2P across to another provider. So a re-establishment of, you know, how you work. Can lead also, of course, we're contacted by GPs and other staff in crisis. It is, you know, a fundamental part of what we do. And we've seen the real consequences. And of course, that can finally lead to the loss of GMC registration. So when we talk about why we're all made the time to meet today, is because what you do is really important, and there's a lot at stake. And you know, what we want to do is avoid any catastrophic consequences that are indeed avoidable. So what allows an unhealthy culture to persist? Why it can persist? So it can be long-standing hierarchies or working styles. We're too busy to fix it because of the pressures and the demands placed upon not only the staff, but the practice as a whole. It might be down to lack of awareness or insight by people too. Often there can be a fear of conflict or upsetting established staff. So people just carry on because they don't want that conflict and confrontation. And it can also, change can feel very risky in an already pressurized environment. So adding something else in that is going to cause disruption can be very daunting. Early warning indicators. So as we've mentioned, some of these before, rising complaints, patient complaints about access, outcomes or attitude, rising serious incidents, rising absence, staff surveys showing a decline, increased informal grievances in HR, frequent rota gaps or last minute changes. You may well be relying a rising reliance on locums or the same staff working more hours routinely, repeated errors and declining quality or the inability to meet targets, which shines that external scrutiny a little bit more. So I'm sure some of the elements from each of the last few slides are relatable to everyone on this call in one way or another. Whether it's in your current role or a previous one, whether it's behaviour you can relate to personally, or you've witnessed, or you've heard about secondhand. You know, you won't be surprised to hear an unhealthy culture is not a decision anyone actively makes. It's something that sort of often builds for a wide-ranging number of reasons. Whether that's someone leaving, someone joining, someone not knowing what they don't know, previous experience elsewhere, increase in demand, change in contracts, change in guidance, changes others make. So things that are way outside of any practice's control. So something someone else stops doing. For example, a trust might just stop doing something altogether and you're expected to pick it up. It might be that somebody starts doing something, but everything that leads a practice to be in a difficult place will be born out of things that we've outlined, because all of those have unintended consequences. You as practices have absorbed them over time until how you once worked and functioned is no longer allowing you to do the things you once did. So to the same standard, not because anyone's failed, but because there are just a new set of demands which require a different way of doing things. From experience, having worked in the NHS for 30 years, people who work in general practice for much of their career do so because they're passionate, they're committed, they're loyal, they care, they're fixers and doers, and you want to make a difference, all of which we know are incredibly positive traits. The downside, of course, is that you can find yourself finding it difficult to say no to things, or asking for help because you don't want to impact others. And over time, it takes its toll, and then things can start to unravel. But the usual default is in that position is such and such, we'll fix it, when actually there needs to be a different approach. So just to recap, for those that attended last time, we did a poll when you were on, 80 plus of you responded. And when we did it, 72% said you'd had a CQC inspection over 2 years ago, with 40% of you not experiencing an inspection for over 6 years. There was also about 20% of you who'd never experienced an inspection. 89 of you working in a practice which is rated good, and 8% outstanding. So there's a lot of good work going on. But we also know it's a movable feast, and it can take its toll. And with the new regime that's come in and re-inspection, that has created a few issues. At that time when we polled, the top 5 barriers to you feeling confident were constantly being in stress mode and firefighting, lack of time, fear of being blamed, lack of understanding and involvement from the staff, and the breadth of the scope that practices cover and individuals, in particular practice managers, have to cover. Let's face it, nobody, if we were asked at school, would say, what do you want to do in the future, would say, I'd like to spend a good chunk of my day feeling stressed in constant catch-up mode and not having enough time and headspace to enact change. However, the team, we can bring about this change. The team can understand the bigger picture, how much what they want to do matters, and how by having a shared understanding, you can all collectively make the working week less reactive and more enjoyable. So we're going to get into some nitty-gritty there. What we can't promise is it'll happen overnight or without effort, but we and the team are going to walk you through what can help create some structure, consistency, clarity, and autonomy. So you're not having to walk around with everything in your head all of the time. You know, we want you to go away with feeling that you're not on your own. This isn't rocket science, and it's not impossible. It just requires an understanding that the stakes are high, but if the desire to reflect and change effect, as well as having an open mindset with a small number of like-minded people to offer advice and share learning and resources, then, you know, it will be absolutely fine. I've supported a number of practices over the years to move from inadequate or requires improvement, and whilst they all wish and would have rather have not been in that situation, every single one has said at the end of the process and the turnaround that there's a silver lining in all of it. Everybody knew the score, everybody knew what was needed, how their role contributed to achieving it, and they were a strong team, mentally, ethos as well. So not recommending anyone goes through a bad experience, but we can share the learning to help you know, more of you avoid that situation. So what does a positive culture feel like to you? What, or put it another way, what makes you want to get up and go to work every day? Any thoughts? Not to put you on the spot.
I think autonomy, being able to act.
Okay, so autonomy. Who you work with, I just saw in the chat come up. Ephro.
Just a bit of focus on things that are going well. I think in general practice, we can focus a lot because of our quality, you know, passion. We can focus a lot on what we can do better. But actually, we do things pretty spectacularly sometimes without even thinking about it, and shouting that out definitely, well, it helps me come to work every day anyway.
Excellent. Johan.
I think I think the main thing for me is you coming to work and having the same goals. Yeah, I don't, you know, the team, someone's put in the chat, the team, and more specifically, it's the team working together, not working on their individual objectives. You know, having a collective goal and then seeing that achieved together and sharing the successes of that is what makes it worthwhile. So you don't have to be the person who did the thing, you're just part of that wider team that achieved it together.
Yeah, absolutely. I can't see all the hands because I've only got a small snippet of screen. So I think is there one more hand?
There is one more. It's Bodrul, I think.
Yeah, I just think it's a situation where everybody actually likes the idea of going into work. It sounds like a sort of alien thing sometimes, and I think if you can achieve that, then you've sort of nailed it, really, haven't you? And it's just having the same core objectives of trying to deliver the best service that we can, and everybody in the team taking ownership for that. And that's from, you know, the cleaner to the senior partner, because it doesn't really work without all the cogs in the wheel. And it's a challenge. It's a real challenge to get that right, but it's a sort of always a work in progress.
It is, and just appreciating that's the goal is the first step, isn't it? Because often to get to that understanding, you've experienced some difficult times or continue to, and it's taking that experience. So I know there's probably a lot more in the chat as well, which will reinforce everything people have also said. So this is basically the formal way of saying what you've just all shared informally. So feeling safe, feeling heard, having the good things recognised, because all too often it's so much easier to focus on the things that aren't right, and we sometimes forget to celebrate what we do well. Just having nice interactions with people and relationships across the board. Clear roles, so people want the clarity, responsibilities, escalation routes, so knowing where to go if there's a problem, consistent leadership behaviours and decision making as well. You want to know that if you ask X, Y, and Z on something very significant and fundamental, you're going to get the same response rather than ping-ponging around. Individual and practice development built into a work plan. So it's not an added bonus, it is integral to you being able to carry out your everyday role, but also for leaders to have the assurance that everybody is skilled in the right areas. Learning culture, so we want all of the things that are flagged by staff or patients or whoever wants to flag a concern, that the issues are used for improvement, not blame. It's not about singling a problem out and people out. It's about looking at it in its entirety and looking at the what we're going to do differently because something's not working. And really, something that I think we don't always do is have we may have transparent and what we consider good communication with our teams, but what we don't always share is the transparency around the pressures that you experience, the priorities that you have and why you have them, the decisions that are made and why they're made, all of which really key to is having the context and the understanding of the wider picture underpinning that, because there's nothing worse than being asked to do something and you really don't know why, so some of the key things as you've said. So I shared this in this first module and I'm not going to go through it in detail, but this is a very good illustration of everything that people have to endure in the working day. And it can come up from nowhere. You think you can be on a particular track. We know that working in general practice can be challenging, but we also know it can be very rewarding. We know the what, so all these what's on this page really in the grand scheme of things are unlikely to change anytime soon. So what practices we want you to do, we want to help you do, is focus on the how and bringing some sort of order. So the following few slides today and also ones that we cover on the next module will go into how practices can make this list more structured, or this chaotic iceberg diagram more structured, manageable, and feel in control of what can sometimes feel out of control. Without question, all the words on this page in that blue section can be grouped and broken down and have processes in place, so you're not just doing one thing but doing A is going to impact B, C, D, and E. So you're working smarter, working more efficiently. Okay. I'm just going to have a sip of water. I apologise for talking so much. Okay, so we're going to start with this slide, which we flashed up at the end of the last session. This is taken from a practice that was rated inadequate last year. And I've colour-coded stuff to make it apparent that there's a lot of good that has been identified in this particular practice. Often inadequate practices, or those deemed inadequate by CQC, often have good in the caring domain, because boy do they care. And typically, as this one does, the national survey patient feedback can often be very positive overall, because patients like their practice, they like the people that work there. They think very highly of them, relationships are relatively stable. But from a CQC perspective, and we'll focus here on the reds and in particular the highlighted ones, there's a lot of things that CQC view as maybe good but incomplete. So we've got staff work with agencies involved in people's care and documentation of consent was present. However, staff had not received up-to-date training to enable them to undertake their role effectively. Environment was clean and well maintained. However, not all risks have been identified. So for each one of those where I've highlighted it, it's just really to stress there's a however. Did not all have the relevant checks. Not all staff had received their annual. The practice did not always investigate. And these are the common themes where things aren't consistently done. And that is usually born out of because the systems that sit behind all of this are not necessarily owned more widely or robust, and there's just not often enough hours in the day for any one person to keep track of an ever-changing picture. So that particular practice was placed in special measures. So we know, you will have heard it many times, you will have been well aware, there's common features of an inadequate practice from a CQC perspective. And they are things like no analysis of significant events or change as a result of significant events. Staffing records recruitment isn't completed in every instance in the same way. There's breaches of confidentiality. There's no clinical audit or audit of other parts of what makes a general practice work well. There might not be up-to-date practices with new clinical practice. There could be training gaps. There could also be poor appointment availability, etc. A whole host. You'll be able to, list far more than I can when things are in a difficult place. But the fundamental thing here for me, and I've highlighted in the red box, is all of those other things typically are born out of whether or not the leadership are present, are owning the overarching principles that hold up general practice and a small business. So there can be absence of vision, unclear roles and responsibilities, poor visibility of leaders with no whole practice meetings. And we've seen it over time, that can be because of governance or lack of communication, which then brings about lack of ownership. So again, not wanting to be doom and gloom, but it's the reality of a situation if you don't have those key frameworks running as well as you'd really like. So again, by contrast, you'll have this to read afterwards if you choose to, but from an outstanding report, I've highlighted the key things that are threaded through every single outstanding report that you would read. Good learning culture, leadership team investigated, in this case, incidents thoroughly. People understood their care and treatment. Leaders, personalised approaches. Staff were empowered, listened to and valued. Leaders and staff, enough staff with the right skills. The list sort of goes through. And again, the last one, a well-embedded culture of continuous improvement. So for each of the two different practices here, although it's highly unlikely, because we're comparing an inadequate to an outstanding, and we know there's a long range in between. But if you're looking at, say, requires improvement or a good and comparing it to outstanding, they could easily all have the same tasks completed, which underpin what you do each day. However, the key difference is that the outstanding doesn't stop at the what. And I'm going to kind of use that terminology quite a lot. The key difference with outstanding is in the so what, and the decision making and actions which then ensues that makes the difference, the key differences. So if we take one of the examples on that page, it says patients knew how to give feedback and were confident the service took it seriously and acted on it. It's quite a broad brush statement. So, okay, if we break it down, so the patients, they know how to give feedback. Great. I'm sure most do. Brilliant. That's a big tick. But why were they confident the service took it seriously and acted on it? It's highly likely in this particular instance because the practice had an established structure and processes which all the feedback went through, whether it was informal, formal, something incidental. There was a standardized process from capturing it to having protected time to look at it, spotting trends and looking for trends, investigating it. The subsequent process changes that were born out of doing the trend analysis and investigating it. The changes were agreed, and that's because they were done in a meeting established for key people to discuss and agree and action those. Then it comes to staff training or briefing, depending on the change that's required. And not only that, it's the subsequent re-audit, rescheduled or scheduled in the audit programme, which we'll come on to make sure things are being maintained. And that has been a common theme. It's going back and re-evaluating is what stands out the most. Of course, clinicians know this. If it's not written down, it didn't happen. Same for meetings, non-clinical work, corridor discussions where you might bump into one another, brainstorm, fix a problem, and then you go away and fix that problem. But if you haven't evidenced it, as far as CQC are concerned, it's not happened. So the formality, is something that may exist in many of what you do and your practices, but it's the key thing that will make a difference. So when all that's done, the patient was obviously then told about the changes, but they also felt the change. There wasn't just a problem documented and discussed, but because change was embedded, because there was a structure to implement and monitor. And it wasn't a process that just rested on the shoulders of one person within the practice doing it on behalf of all. It was a shared experience and process that was visible. So what we'll do now is I've picked a couple of areas that I would like to delve deeper into, because it's all very well me sitting here spouting on, you know, advice on how to do this, but let's make it a bit more meaningful. So I've brought up a slide around the 34 quality statements that we touched on last time and are available. And I'm focusing in for the first one on safe and effective staffing. The reason for that is because it is one of the most scrutinised areas under the current regime. It directly influences, so it sits under safe, but it directly influences ratings across safe, effective, well-led and responsive. So it is a big area. CQC expects practices to demonstrate not just the adequate staffing, but proactive workforce planning, robust governance, and a culture that protects staff well-being and patient safety. And that doesn't happen overnight. As I've said, it impacts 4 out of the 5 domains, and it can bring many of the work areas we saw in that iceberg diagram into one work stream. So rather than seeing that, how do I find the time to bring all that together, we start to bring the different areas into one area within the practice. This is a snapshot of how CQC describe it on their website. Links at the bottom if you want to go straight in and have a look. And what they're basically wanting to see is robust and safe practices, everything to do with staffing, recruitment, disciplinary, capability processes. So not just ticking the right box on recruitment, but maintaining capability and flexing to the needs of the patients and subsequently the role. Appropriate training, appropriate supervision. And this isn't just for people you employ, but it's for people who work within your practice environment, such as your R staff. They want to go in and see that you have all the relevant documentation for those individuals, even if you haven't hired them, because they are working, you know, under your guide and supervision whilst in the practice. There's I statements as well from a patient perspective, saying they want to feel supported and safe. Treatment, including medication, has to change. I want to know why, and I'm involved in that decision. I have considerate support delivered by competent people. So patients aren't asking for much, are they? You know, it's not a small undertaking, but with the right foundations, that can start to become the norm. So safe and effective staffing. Let's start with the red flags like we did previously when we were talking about culture. Any thoughts on what would be a red flag, common red flag where safe and effective staffing in that regard? Go on, Afro.
Telephone statistics.
Sorry.
Sorry, Afro.
You're fine. Maybe an over-reliance on partners, you know, no wider staffing team around the clinical partnership, meaning that a lot of pressure is put on sometimes small partnerships.
Yeah, so over-reliance, whether it's on partners or other members of the team and individuals. I think I just saw flash up a high staff turnover. Yeah, and there's a few more in a nice big red box. So yeah, over-reliance, absolutely. High reliance on locums with limited oversight. So nothing wrong with using locums, providing they're working in a way that the practice wants and is having assurance and oversight of. Poor oversight of ours roles, which, you know, has created issues in the past for practices because they didn't know they needed a full trail and evidence and assurance around the recruitment of those staff. Inconsistency in induction or supervision, so it might be ad hoc, it might not be structured. Overdue training would be a huge, great big flag, especially around mandatory training, or missing competencies, or not having competencies set. People whose roles are evolving from maybe an admin to having some responsibility around clinical elements, might be doing that where they're not trained in a safe way. They might be doing it without supervision from a clinician. Staff reporting burnout or lack of support, rotas mismatched to demand patterns. So you've got, you know, more staff on certain days when the data is showing you that actually it needs to be set differently. Frequent rota gaps or unsafe duty days. So where all of a sudden there'll be an influx and there'll be one person going through everything and managing it. Lack of documented workforce planning. And workforce risks not discussed at governance meetings as well. If indeed you have governance meetings, which again might not be standard, or you might wrap it or describe it as something else. So what we do know is when CQC come in, we know that they're looking in the background at data on a continual basis. We're not just in the space where they give you some notice, come in, it's like a process that's done and dusted over maybe 2 or 3 weeks. We know there's a continual monitoring in the background now. But the sorts of things that partners and senior members of the team need to be prepared to answer confidently are the questions there. Those are the sorts of questions that are going to come up. How do you know staffing is safe? How do you monitor demands and adjust staffing? How do you ensure staff are competent for their roles? Sometimes you can be doing everything you need to. They ask a question phrased in a different way, and we think, what do they mean? And it's, you know, test the practices that we can get in place can test that as well, and bring it all together. What risks related to staffing are on your risk register? Who has a risk register? I don't know many that do. What actions have you taken when staffing concerns were raised? So a whole bunch of really pertinent questions. And these questions, what they're doing is they're testing the leadership grip, the governance and the culture of the practice, as well as wanting the actual evidence that you're collecting and you're doing. So what we'll do now, I mentioned the what. We're going to look at the what for this particular area now in a little bit of detail. I won't read them all out because you will fall asleep, but again, they're here for you to take away, and chances are you've got a checklist and you know anyway. But this can be split into 4 different areas, the safe and effective staffing. So we'll start with the recruitment / onboarding, because it's not just about the recruitment side, but of course the standard tools that you will have are your policies, are your job descriptions. Ideally, you would have some sort of recruitment dashboard, because what they do is, rather than have all your individual folders, as we always had, whether it's in a filing cabinet or in a folder, a confidential password protected folder on the shared drive for certain people only. Whatever it is, what you don't want to be doing is on the day of inspection is going into each of those, flicking through if you're asked a question. What ideally you would be doing is having a dashboard or a checklist, whatever you want to call it, and we've got one to show you in a little while that we're happy to share and people can adapt if you don't have one, all in one place, because what that does is it gives the person responsible for that area immediate oversight of a position. You can, and what that does in an inspection sort of environment is it gives the inspector confidence that you have oversight very, very quickly. And then, you know, the questions will ensue from there. Within there, you're going to want evidence of role-specific onboarding that's taking place, whether that's EMIS, workflow, triage protocols, locum induction pack and monitoring, because it's not just about the giving a pack, but it's also about checking that they are doing what you wanted to and how you wanted it. Otherwise, there will be unintended consequences for the regular staff within the practice. Standardized digital files. So again, if you've been, you know, your practice has been going for 20 years, chances are there may have been a change in staff, there may be a haphazard way of doing things, but when they come and choose to look at files, they won't necessarily take the last 3 that you've done. They might decide they want a good snapshot from across the years. So it really is about bringing consistency to the forefront. Appraisals they're going to want to see, and you should be having that in, you know, ideally an overarching format. And of course, things like probation review documentation, because they're going to want to see that, you know, you've employed someone, you've inducted them, they know what they're doing, and that you've reviewed that they are fit for purpose and practicing safely. Then goes on to the competence and training and supervision side of things. So you're likely to have these already in one form or another. Policies, not only for training, but for supervision. Dashboards, so I've said that before, around having a place you can go and see things very easily. Many of you will have something that you buy in for your training, a dashboard, whether it's on an intranet, whether it's on Bluestream. You will have adapted and done this over the years, which already flags up, but it's about using it and having in the usual processes. And we do have a very basic version of that for anyone that doesn't have something or wants to consider something different. Documented competencies for clinical and non-clinical roles, regular supervision and competency assessments, not just for your own staff, but for ours. We know that can take its toll on practices because there isn't necessarily any allocated time or budget for practices to do that supervisory role, but it kind of comes as a given that if you're using those staff, you're supervising them as well and accountable for them. And also protected learning time built into rotas, structured and evidenced. The bit that sometimes may be lacking, and that's completely understandable, but this is really the key to bringing it all together. A workforce planning, whether you want to call it a document, pack, set of spreadsheets, whatever it might be, however you best work, but it's around covering recruitment, retention and succession planning. So, you know, what's our demand? What do we need to work safely? What is the ideal? An org chart, so you can easily identify CQC are likely to want it when you do your presentation at the start of the visit. They're going to want to see that. Staffing levels aligned to demand, complexity and risk. So, you know, absolute key is having the right staff at the right time doing the right things. And and workflow fitting into those as well. Skill mix review, you want your good skill mix that supports clinical and safe care and administrative workflows. And thinking about when things go wrong, your contingency planning for sickness surges. And in one of the areas, we've been doing some work about, obviously, in the safety elements, we talk about fire, but even bringing in new things around what happens, as we've seen in Salford recently, where there was a terrorist attack. You know, staff have been massively impacted by that. And the learning that we want to take from that is, just as you have fire drills, we want to come up with a framework for you to have drills so people have confidence that they know exactly what they're doing if the practice or the surrounding area is under threat. Risk logs, as we've mentioned, and that could include sickness, turnover, skill gaps, and an incident log. And the reason I say that, you will have an overarching incident log where you're capturing things, however you define that within your practice. But what's really key is the things that relate to internal incidents relating to workforce or staffing. And it is things that happen where there's, say, a clinical issue that the process brings in. Did we have the right staff on at the right time with the right training as well? And then really key and very unlikely to be widespread, but it's something that I encouraged every practice that I've ever supported to put in place, is a clear and documented allocation of responsibilities at partner level. Clinical level, so there might be somebody else, there might be a salaried, there might be a physician associate, there might be a nursing assistant, there might be somebody else who has the day-to-day work responsibility, but there is stringent oversight and key responsibilities. What we have seen in practices that have struggled before is when there's a senior partner that has many different areas of responsibility, and they struggle, and others within the clinical team don't have the same level of responsibility. And although executive partners, you know, might have opted to do that, and they might do fewer clinical sessions as a result, or they might have other concessions, ultimately everything that's needed in order to thrive rather than just survive can't be reliant on one person or a handful of people. There has to be shared responsibility. And then lastly on this slide is around, of course, staff wellbeing and psychological safety. So process for staff to raise concerns, which is evidenced and reviewed, and actions in place and feedback themes. And that might be formal meetings, anonymous routes. In previous practices that I've supported, I've said, have an anonymous post box in your staff room whilst we're going through this process. People, you know, want to give your feedback because they want to work here, they care, but they need that freedom to be able to share without feeling, you know, singled out. Monitoring of burnout and workload pressure, staff check-ins. Of course, you'll have, we know it was decommissioned nationally, and general practices had to find their own route to occupational health. But this is also, I think, brought an opportunity, because I know many of you will have, as part of that commissioned service, a wellbeing service, because I think that's the evolution of where it's gone. And we know there is that responsibility as part of the PCM work as well. Staff survey results, actions evidenced, leave monitoring, so you can check on patterns, trends, and wellbeing initiatives such as flexible working and support mechanisms, perhaps mentoring. So that was the what, and then it kind of brings us on to the so what. And that's the real test for me of how we can easily sort of move ourselves into the outstanding space, because everything you do is followed by a so what. As the slide says, safe and effective staffing is not about numbers. It's about governance, culture, and leadership assurance. So the so what in this particular example, CQC wants practice leadership to demonstrate evidence-based decision-making, a safe, supported workforce, and a culture that prioritises learning and well-being, because they know that underpins most of the other domains, and it's fundamental to retaining staff. So the so what starts with having the right governance in place to allow the right people to review the right data and intel, and then to make the right decisions based on evidence and facts. So, nice busy slide. Sorry for that. It was a bit of a brain dump, but wanted to get as much of this down in writing as we could. So it's about, so you will all have specific meetings that you have. There'll be standing item agendas. I don't know how many of you have standing item agendas on workforce or specific workforce meetings, but given it is such a wide scope, it may be something that you want to consider. Doesn't sound very exciting, does it, a workforce meeting? But it's much broader than that, and we can come up with a different name for it. But what those really need to be looking at is regular, ideally monthly, on such a fundamental area, with the leadership team, meeting to review risks relating to staffing. And that doesn't mean they're all going away and getting all that data, but you might have a number of different data sources set up. We plan to create and share a document that can house all of that for you, which can then generate a summary that you can then take to such meetings. You may have one already, but it's about just giving you some options. But the sorts of things that we'd be looking for on there is not the what, but the so what. So the completion rate, the high level information, completion rates of things such as mandatory training, the number of completed protected learning time, actual versus a plan, supervision sections, actual against plan, competency assessments, actual against plan. And by doing those things against a plan means you've had a plan in the first place, which means there's been a shared discussion about what does safe working look like in your practice? What skills do you need? What skills do you need those people to have? What are the processes going to be? So, number of patient complaints where staff related matters are a contributor, staff concerns raised, annual leave ratios. So, is there a lot of staff that haven't taken leave? And why is that? And what's that going to mean when you ask them to take their leave? And that sort of, it gives you time, if you have it in this sort of way, of acting in proactively rather than having to do it reactively. So as well as that sort of information, you'd then want your risk log sitting behind this, analysis of your demand, data and capacity and social mix, skill mix. And then when you've got that in front of you, you might think, wow, something's not happening here. There's some things fallen down, or it might be absent, it might be something. And it's the opportunity then to have that deeper dive. You're not going to get through if you've got a few flagging all in one meeting. We know that, but it's about keeping momentum going, having agreed actions, having audit areas agreed on these particular things, because you might need to go away and get more information, having somebody named as the responsible person, having deadlines, having logs updated and shared, because remember, if you didn't write it down, it didn't happen. Future review date set, And of course, when you know where the problem is and you know what you want to change because you've got the evidence to back it up, you need to tell people. But in, again, a way that is evidenced and that people can, it's meaningful to them. Okay, so we've got 20 minutes left and we got another example to go through, which is set slightly differently, but I'll carry on going unless anybody's got any questions at this point. I'm hoping I'm not whizzing through this too much. Okay, so let's pick another biggie. Monitoring and improving outcomes. Okay, so what does this relate to? Sits in the effective line, but again, will be cross-cutting. It's about routinely monitoring people's care and treatment in order to not just accept the status quo or introduce risk, but to improve it, to ensure outcomes are positive and consistent, and they meet both clinical expectation and the expectations of patients and people themselves. So the subtopics in this area, they're clinical outcomes, benchmarking, service accreditation schemes, quality of life outcomes. So if we move on to look at some of this, sorry, my things of coming in have gone slightly wrong, but I'm going to start with the CQC red flags where this isn't working, in their opinion, overly well, and what that might look like. So practically, no re-audit cycle. So you've got your audit cycle, but you've not got a follow-up re-audit cycle. Data is collected and it's sometimes reviewed, but no action is taken. Variation between clinicians. So you've maybe done a bit of a search, you've had a look at referral rate or follow-up rate or some other marker. There appears to be variation, some of which seems to be unwarranted variation, but it's just left. It's not, there's no oversight or a plan to understand that more. Poor medicine safely monitoring and untimely recall. And we know that has been a massive area in the last tranche of visits. They were really scrutinising the recall of the high-risk drugs. And also what they were doing was, say, for example, you get your notification, you've got a little bit of a backlog, you're going in and doing what you need to do. They were going in and looking at the dates these were done, and if they were blocked down, they were highlighting that as a reactive response rather than normal practice. And they were, you know, creating points out of that. Might be looking at your low screening and IMS uptake, but without an action plan. So how are you going to drive improvement in that? Because it's typically the more vulnerable patients or the more deprived areas, or where there's cultural difference, and they would want to really see that you've got specific actions around that. And lack of evidence of sustained improvement. Sorts of things practice leaders will be absolutely asked and be expected to answer confidently are in that second box. How do you know your clinical outcomes are good? How do you identify variation or risk? How do you use audits to drive improvement? So many people will know how to answer those, but it's evidencing it that's going to be key, because they will go on and have a look. So this is a slightly different format to the first time round. The detail is in here. There is quite a lot of it because, again, it's a big subject, but this can bring a lot of those different iceberg elements into one space. So it's all holistically managed and monitored. How the practice monitors, we've got a list there of systems to include, what you may choose to look at, whether it's QOF, LTC indicators, medicine safety, weekly review of workflow safety and coding accuracy, monthly review of screening and immunisation uptakes. So we've gone through, and in the interest of time, I won't go through everyone, but there is a framework there to start to either check off what you already do or just set and sense check or start to use. Because again, together, these all kind of will impact the effective and the safe elements without a question. In the yellow at the bottom, I haven't got a separate side of the so what's in the what, but the so what's come in here in the highlights. Improvements made in response to feedback. So everything you're monitoring and looking at and seeing where there's outliers is the so what are you going to do about it? What are you going to change? What are you going to put in place? And how are you going to embed it more widely? We've got a second page of that as well. Again, it's about updating something, changing something and evidencing that change. Some of the things that people should be ready to evidence on the day of an inspection, and we can talk about this at the next one a little bit more, but not just you've got your rotors and they're fully staffed, but they're aligned to demand. Your training matrices, your induction and supervision documents, your results and what you've done as a result of your staff results, and clear allocation of workflow and responsibility, whether that's Dr. X is overseeing this side of things or safeguarding, but have that accountability of who is leading on one, because that breeds confidence and give assurance to the inspector. Demonstrate compliance is around leadership, reviewing outcome dashboards regularly, whether it's on a monthly cycle, a 3-monthly cycle, but always going back to something. Your audits and re-audits, monitor inequalities and variation themes, improvements clearly document, share as a team, share, have your protected learning time, share the learning and explain why it's changing. Ensure staff understand the expectations and embed it into patient feedback as well. It shows that leadership are in control, proactive and accountable. And this is often the bit that is missing. You're doing all the work. You're really striving to make improvements, but it's not stored, it's not discussed in a single place that you can refer to, or that everybody can get into that space and have the headspace to do and get under the things. So I know many of you will be thinking, well, how the heck are we supposed to factor all this in? Chances are you're already spending time doing this. It's just in a very different way. And the summary for partners and management is they'll want you to have clear oversight and evidence of your decision making, safe, supported workforce, and a culture that prioritises learning and wellbeing. And they're the key elements. So this is another way of doing it, just as a guide. You might think, don't like that sort of thing, but I didn't want to present everything in the same way. So this could be a quick self-assessment of those areas, the green, the amber, the red. regular reviews, clear processes, evidence of action. Great. Monitoring is inconsistent, some gaps, okay? Not awful, but it could be better. And then we've got the high risk areas as well. And those same principles can apply to everything and anything. I won't stress what I was going to with that red circle. I think I've done that. So the take home, I suppose, is I know we've only explored 2 areas, and you're probably thinking, yeah, but there's 34. Well, each will be linked with something else. Each will have a set of outcomes that can be grouped. So you're not looking at 34 separate areas because they can be brought into more manageable chunks. But the things that we really know make a difference to influencing the calmness, the structure, and all the things that we know then give people the motivation to turn up every day and do their job well, with clarity, is born out of many of these practical things. So different data, but the same process. So we will always recommend each work stream, one of the major ones, is allocated to a partner with overarching accountability, because no one person can do this. And, you know, partners are all equally liable where there's risk and liability. So, you know, this is about shared ownership. Identified leads, clinical, managerial, team members. So again, you might be thinking, well, how on earth are going to people stop doing what they're doing in order to do this? Your team members, the people on the ground, the doers, they're already doing this. You might just not recognize it as achieving a part of the objectives that you have under this sort of work area. But everybody's doing something that is contributing. But let's bring it into more of a sort of a holistic approach rather than people working in silos. Scheduled meetings planned over the year in which the leads and relevant others will meet and be responsible, discussing, actioning things, reviewing things. And really that also needs to have an escalation route if things are happening and go off piste outside of that. Suite of documents used for all work areas, standardizing so it becomes the norm, agenda template, minutes, if you're going to do minutes, action logs, overarching dashboards. And then we've got that set format, the one that I spoke through and to earlier in that particular staffing example. Have those as your set process and your chat list of going through. They show, just as we've said before, that you're in control, you're proactive, and you're accountable. So just to share, and again, we will be bringing these to the next round and hopefully a couple more that we can go through in a little bit more detail. This, for example, is something that I created having spent a fair amount of time with a number of practices who found themselves in a difficult situation for CQC. And it was one of the solutions was a very simple, this is a dashboard for recruitment process. So all the different elements that everybody's folder, everybody should go through with evidence in one place. The key thing that was missing a lot when people were doing it in an individual way was the rechecking the professional body registration, because obviously that needs to go through revalidation. And that was something that can cause problems if you're not rechecking that within the time frame of when that's done. So if you've got that all on here, if you're doing it once, if they're aligned, you know, you can update it and know that it's done. This is there then, if somebody who normally owns this is not in, it's easy to pick it up, see where the reds are. On the actual one, we've got drop downs and it turns to red. You can put the date in when you last did it, and it just gives that really good oversight. We've got the same, I mentioned training tracker. You will probably have very fancy tools already that you use that may or may not give you what you need. This is going back to basics, but on here we've got the mandatory training, what's statutory and mandatory. We've got the staff groups that it applies to. We've got the frequency of when it should be done based on what the guidance is telling us. The links to where you can go where it's generic on e-learning for health. And then to the right is a whole bunch of lines with everybody's names, whether or not it's for them to do. And then whether they've done it will be determined when it's coming up to being out of date. The formulas can turn it amber. So you've got notice ahead of time to make sure everybody's aware and able to do that. We've also created, and again, not everybody will do this, but I can't recommend it enough, of having an areas of responsibility where the practice leads. Again, all of these can be a tab on the same document, but it's about who is responsible overall, because no one person can be. So you've got the responsible partner. Partners are going to love me, aren't they? Sorry, partners on the call. It's to protect you as much as your staff and your patients. Clinical lead, because remember, they don't have to be the same person. This is about oversight versus doing. Non-clinical lead, and actually some of these are really time critical. So who's going to cover you if you're not around for 2 weeks or 3 weeks? Staff need to know who to go to. So that should always be factored in. And then what I also recommend is having a work plan for each of the quarters to keep yourselves on track and hold one another to account. Practice meeting schedule. Nearly in the last throes of the slides. Again, this didn't exist that I was aware of, but I thought, gosh, this is a common theme impacting practices constantly because they didn't have the right governance in place. So how better to do this is to have a very simple spreadsheet if needs be, like we've created here, what the purpose is, who's going to chair it and be responsible for the agenda, who's required, the link to the shared drive where you keep it all. So if CQC want to come in and look at what's your audit cycles like, somebody can go in, go straight to the relevant place on the shared drive and have access to it. And schedule your meetings a year in advance. It doesn't have to be every month, but you want to be scheduling things. Obviously partners meetings would be more frequent, but things could be bi-monthly, quarterly, bi-annually, but have it scheduled and in everybody's diaries. Your protected learning time scheduled, applied for, and so you're not on a back foot. So before we come on to questions, there's only a minute left. This is going to be next time. I think I scheduled this for April, which seems like a long way away, but I thought, why would I do this in March? I'd be shot down, wouldn't I, by probably all of you, or I'd have an empty group. So we've scheduled it for April when the dust has settled a little bit. We're going to be going through these tools in more detail. In the meantime, we will share the ones we have, but on the understanding that we will refresh an entire toolkit in the meantime, because that's what we've been commissioned to do for you as well. We'll talk about preparing staff for inspections with confidence and consistency, and the other things you can use, like the staff stories and patient experience as your cultural evidence, and how you go on to evidence the cultural elements. I did put a slide for questions, and I can only apologise that we've come to the end of the session. But if they are in the chat, or you're welcome to contact us outside of the meeting. But before you go, we really need your feedback. It's part of what we need to do. We want to be able to meet your needs and pitch this and have the tone right. So we're halfway through these modules. We've got 2 more to go. If you can send us, fill this form in, we would be very, very grateful. In the meantime, reach out if you need to, whether it's to us or your own LMC. But, you know, we want to help. Okay. Thanks all for giving up your time.
Thanks,
Take care.
Eve.
Cheers.
Bye. Bye.